go ahead and reconvene the special meeting from closed session. City Attorney.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council did meet in closed session. There were intended to be several items of closed session materials, including negotiations, but all the council had time for was to discuss negotiations with the associations. The CEA negotiations will continue after this, at the end of this meeting, and also the litigation portion of the closed session will continue after this meeting. No reportable action was taken.
Perfect, thank you. We're going to move on to item 4, special orders of the day. Review of proposed fiscal year 2014-15 operating budget. City Manager?
Mr. Mayor, would you like to go to public comment at this point? No, we don't have it on our listed right here, but it would be appropriate to take any
City Attorney
comments.
actually told me that. I'd like to open this for any public comment. Seeing none, we'll close, and now we'll move on to the City Manager's report.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Tonight we are going to be discussing the fiscal year 2014-2015 preliminary budget, and this is the kickoff meeting for the budget process. We're going to go through a number of slides and discuss where we are this fiscal year in terms of fiscal year 13-14 and our most recent revised estimated actual. We'll talk about a projected surplus that we have in this current fiscal year and how we might use that into the next fiscal year. We're looking at a snapshot in time, and that's what the preliminary budget is, and that's our best projections right now in terms of overall expenditures, overall revenues, and tonight we're going to focus in on the general fund. We will look at, we have an initial difference or general fund expenditures right now as a snapshot exceeding general fund revenues for fiscal year 14-15, or a gap of $520,000, which we are going to talk about tonight. We have a proposed list of potential gap closure items that we've put together for council consideration that we would like your initial feedback on tonight, and if there's any additional items to add to the list, we will analyze those. We'll put together a comprehensive list. We'll modify the list that we have tonight. We'll bring that back on May 19th, the next meeting in the budget process. Glenn will go over the calendar of where we go through the process, what meetings will be included. And we also are going to talk about our long-term liability with PERS, the retirement liability, and we'll talk and introduce a plan for addressing that now and in the future. We're also going to talk tonight about fund balance reserves and an analysis of the reserves and fund balance policy. We have been meeting regularly with the budget subcommittee, so the budget subcommittee can weigh in at any one time. The council can weigh in at any time as we're going through the presentation as Glenn gets into it. But in terms of this, I look at this right now optimistically as an opportunity for the city. We're looking at the fiscal health of the city. We're looking at the short-term well-being and establishing a policy that would allow the city to have a balanced budget now and in the future. We're looking at providing tools, both in terms of the items that will be on that comprehensive list to close the gap. If the council adopts some of those items, those would be good long-term tools, either in terms of new revenue generators or offset of expenditures on an ongoing basis. And the reserve policy that we will discuss is an opportunity to really look at what the appropriate level of general fund reserves is, what the recommendation would be for establishing a policy for the right level in the future, and how to use those reserves to establish a long-term fiscal sustainability for the city. So I am very encouraged that we have had the opportunity to work with the budget subcommittee. I think that's going to pave the way very well for the future and for this process and for being able to address questions and issues as we go forward. We look forward to the council feedback and the public feedback as we move forward. So with that, we are going to be here, staff is all here to answer questions, and Glenn, our interim director of administrative services, will be giving the presentation, and we will get into it right now.
City Manager, if I may, I'd like to ask the council in interest of time, because we have the closed session items after, would we prefer to hold our questions to the end, or would you like to engage as we go? It just seems to take a little longer if we do that. What do you prefer?
We can hear the presentations, but if we're not able to go through the budget stuff tonight, then I think we need to do another meeting, because I have questions.
That's great. How do you feel, gentlemen?
We've had a chance to ask a lot of questions
Yeah.
already, so.
Yeah, you know, from the budget subcommittee, which is Mayor Pro Tem Murphy and myself, the only thing I would say is kind of a headline before, since we're going to be quiet all the way through, and I'll be supportive of that. We have a $520,000 problem, and it's pretty significant. We want to be able to convey to you guys that we have went through the details of the revenue, the expense, the reserves, the capital improvement process, and can answer questions, but because it's such a significant bridge, there's some policy discussions that we need to have. And we thought the best thing to do is also to involve the community, is to keep this at a macro level for this presentation, so everybody can see the entire picture, weigh in, see what you think, and then when we come back on May 19th, which is what they're going to show you, then we'll go into the details. And we are also going to propose some policy issues, how the council deal with the chasm, but we don't want to be too heavy-handed and over-controlling. So in respect of the rest of the council, you just need to know that that's what we did, and we'll be quiet as he goes through, but that's where we left off, and we just wanted to let you guys know that we had thought through some of the solutions.
Okay. Councilmember Kuzumoto?
I'm fine with, let's just kind of get through this, and then,
Okay.
I guess I would just ask if there are questions. I would like to at least get the questions out there, maybe not engage in terms of the debate, but somehow we can just get, so while we're thinking about it, I think we just need the questions out. But, just to kind of plow through the presentation would be, I think, adequate.
Okay. Glenn?
Okay. Welcome, Mayor and members of council, and to staff and to members of the audience, the public. For those of you who didn't hear, I'm Glenn Steinbrink. I'm your interim administrative services director for the city. And I'm going to keep this at a macro level, and if you want to hold your questions to the end, that's fine with me, but however, I do not mind being interrupted at any time with either comments or questions, especially from the budget subcommittee. If there's something that I omitted that they feel I should have included in the presentation, that I really would like them to give their thoughts as to what I'm saying as we go along. But I will try and get through this as rapidly as possible. I don't have a lot of slides. I have a lot to say on each slide, but I'll try and keep my comments limited in the interest of time. So the first thing is the budget calendar, and this sort of gives you an idea where we want you to head with regards to the budget. Tonight is general fund only at a very macro level. 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to come back with a report on special funds and capital projects, and those are very much related because most of your special revenue funds are used to pay for capital projects. And then also fund balance reserves and unfunded liabilities, which I'm going to touch on tonight, but we'll have a more detailed discussion in 2 weeks. June 2nd is the third meeting that's scheduled if needed. If we don't complete everything that we want to complete by May the 19th, we can go ahead with that third meeting on June 2nd to finish up whatever we don't finish tonight and on the 19th. And then finally, we're scheduled for the budget adoption on June the 16th. So I'm going to start with this fiscal year and then next fiscal year. This fiscal year, we estimate our revenues and our expenditures through the end of the fiscal year. We're estimating a surplus for 13-14 of about $330,000. In the staff report, I put in a range between $200,000 and $350,000 because we are trying to project where we're going to end up by June 30. It's our best estimate based on a lot of different factors, a lot of which is where are we at so far this fiscal year. Through February 28th is when I did these projections. And a lot can happen in March, April, May, and June. But my guess is that more likely whatever happens between now and June 30th is going to increase this number rather than decrease this number. And anything that happens between now and June 30th, I don't believe is going to be a significant item. I don't think we've missed anything that we're going to wonder, June 30th, how did we miss this particular item? So I think it's a pretty solid number, could grow a little bit. 1415 is your problem. I'm going to be showing a lot of other slides tonight that look like problems, but they're really not problems. The 1415 is your major problem. So I'm going to talk primarily about that tonight. $520,000 shortfall, that our expenditures exceed revenues in the 1415 budget. We've given you in the staff report several options to close this budget gap. We'd like council to take the next 2 weeks to go through our list. If you come up with an additional suggestion to add to our list, we would welcome those suggestions. We will have a more comprehensive list in 2 weeks based upon your input. We welcome input from other departments in the city and from the public as well. But I'm not going to get into detail on those options tonight, on what we've suggested, except with one exception, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So I want to talk about the budget gap for 1415. What is causing a $520,000 excess of expenditures over revenues in 1415? So I've itemized them here. First one is increased costs for citywide retirement contributions. The second one is capital expenditures in the police budget for the 800 megahertz system and Westcom contractual services. That 139, just so you know, 110,000 of that is for the 800 megahertz system, 29,000 of that is for Westcom contractual. An increase in hours in park maintenance for maintenance workers to maintain the sports fields and parks as a result of the joint use agreement with the school district. And also related to that last bullet, increased costs for water and fertigation for the sports fields and parks. Increased costs for retiree medical. And then finally, increased property insurance, PERS contribution increases, minimum wage increases, and workers' comp and liability insurance, including a retrospective adjustment that the JPIA is going to make for workers' compensation that we believe is in the area of $26,000 a year, but we haven't received the final number on that yet. So this grand total is $492,000. That doesn't make up all of the 520. There's a lot of ups and downs throughout the entire budget. Some items increasing, some items decreasing. But these are the major contributors to the $520,000 gap. But we're actually going from a surplus of $335,000 to an excess of expenditures over revenues of $520,000. That's an $850,000 swing. It isn't just expenditures. So I also want to show what's happening on the revenue side. And on the revenue side, you'll notice that you have a significant increase in 1314 estimated. That increase is due primarily to two items. One would be the building activity revenues that have been received in 1314 for the Los Alamitos Medical Center, plan checks and building permits. And that construction is substantially completed, so we cannot expect a repeat of those revenues in 1415. The other item is reimbursements that we receive in miscellaneous revenues from the insurance companies for workers' compensation claims that were paid in prior fiscal years. It could be a number of fiscal years prior to the current fiscal year. And therefore, that revenue source is kind of volatile and swings widely from year to year. So while we believe that we may bring in $200,000 in 13-14, we took the estimate, the proposed budget in 14-15 back down to $50,000, which is more of a historical average for that revenue source over a period of a lot of years. So you can see that our 13-14 revenues are going to be up 2.6%. Then just looking at 14-15 proposed compared to 13-14, we're going to be down 1.43% because of those two major revenue sources that I cited. But even if you're looking at the budget from 13-14 to 14-15, we're up only 1.13% from the adjusted budget for 13-14. And by adjusted budget, I mean that budget includes all of the changes in the budget that were approved by council at the mid-year. So it's not your adopted budget, it's your budget that has been adjusted right up through your mid-year adjustments that were made a couple of months ago. 1.13% is not a great change in revenues for the general fund, but it's fairly typical of what I have seen in a lot of other cities. Although there's a lot of talk lately about the economy improving and that the unemployment rate's going down and people are buying houses again, et cetera, we're not yet seeing that in cities. We're not seeing it in this city. I'm not seeing it in other cities. I don't know of any city that's showing a tremendous increase in general fund revenues. So this is not atypical for what I'm seeing for the other cities. This is a breakdown of all of the revenues in the general fund. You can see the totals at the bottom. They correspond with the previous slide. So our estimated revenues are supposed to be up 2.6 based on our estimates. You can see that the major categories, even though licenses and permits was budgeted higher, it appears at this time we're not going to make even the adjusted budget, and we're going to be down. And the huge increase in the miscellaneous revenues is the amount for the reimbursements that we receive from the insurance company for workers' comp. 200,000 of that 250,000 is for those reimbursements that we receive from the insurance companies. But then if you look at the 14-15 budget, we're seeing a tremendous drop in licenses and permits, which is the building activity-related fees that we receive from building permits, plan checks, et cetera. There is a drop in miscellaneous revenues, again for the insurance reimbursements. A drop in transfers in, and that drop from 382 to 328 is due solely to gas tax revenues. We know how much revenue we're going to receive from gas tax in 14-15. The state tells us how much money we're going to receive. We take that money and we allocate whatever we need of that revenue source to capital projects to pay for street projects. And whatever's left, the difference between the revenue we know we're going to receive and what we need for capital projects, that difference is transferred to the general fund to reimburse the general fund for street-related maintenance costs. And so that drop from 382 to 328 is because we're transferring 177,000 in 13-14, but we're only transferring about 120-some thousand in 14-15. Now I want to talk a little bit about unfunded liabilities, so I'm going to start with the retirement system. I want to start by saying that you probably haven't seen these numbers before, and one good reason why you've never seen these numbers before is because they weren't provided to you. Back in 02-03, legislation was passed which mandated the city to go into a risk pool because you have fewer than 100 employees in safety and you have fewer than 100 employees in miscellaneous. So you were placed into a risk pool that set your employer rates for the fiscal year '05-06. From '05-06 to fiscal year '09-10, the only information that the city received was information for the pool and not information for the city of Los Alamitos. What I'm showing you here is the 2 years that they are now giving you information exclusively for the city of Los Alamitos. You're still in a risk pool. You still receive some information for the risk pool, but they are now giving you your assets and your liabilities within that risk pool. Prior to these 2 years, the only way you would have been able to determine what your share of these dollars were in the pool was to use a pro rata factor. And probably the best pro rata factor to use would have been your covered payroll for this city versus the covered payroll for the pool. But very few people did that. I did that in some of the other cities that I've worked in that are also in risk pools. This is better information. I'm glad they've started doing this. This is kind of important now, even more so than it was previously, because now PERS is talking about reducing the number of risk pools, and I believe there's about 9 risk pools currently. Each risk pool is for the formula that the employees are under within your agency. So when I say safety, for example, your risk pool is the 3% of 50 formula, and all of the agencies that are in the risk pool with you for safety have the 3% at 50 formula. And there's hundreds of them within your risk pool. You'll see where this is important in a couple more slides, but let me go on to miscellaneous. Same thing with miscellaneous. You're also about 73% funded for miscellaneous. This is your share of the liabilities and market value of assets for the pool. There is a thing within your retirement called a side fund liability. And very briefly, I want to describe what that is because it has to do with one of the recommendations that you'll see for closing the budget gap is to pay off your side fund liability in PERS. At the time you were forced to join a risk pool, your funding ratio was different from all of the other agencies that were being placed into your same risk pool. They didn't want your unfunded liability to become the liability of the pool, nor did they want other agencies' liabilities to become your liability in this city. So they segregated your unfunded liability at the time you were forced to join a risk pool, and they said you're going to pay that down separately from the amount that you're going to contribute to the risk pool for retirement contributions. And you've been paying on that side fund liability since '05-06. At the end of this fiscal year, you will have 12 years remaining on that side fund liability. We're recommending that you pay that off, and the reason we're recommending that you pay it off is because it's a small enough amount where one of the prudent uses of general fund reserves is one-time expenditures that save the city money. And so we think it's a prudent use of general fund reserves to pay off that side fund liability, which is about $260,000. That's going to save you $150,000 in interest over that 12-year period, or about $12,500 a year in interest costs. Why does PERS charge you 7.5%? Because that's their assumed investment return in the retirement system. If they have your money, then they assume they're going to make 7.5% on your money. If it's an unfunded liability, they don't have your money. Therefore, they can't make 7.5%. Therefore, they're going to charge you that 7.5%. So you're paying 7.5% on these unfunded liabilities, and you're also paying 7.5% on the side fund. That is the extremely high rate of interest expense these days. If you had, $15 million to spare in your general fund reserves, it might behoove you to pay off the unfunded liability, but I don't believe it would, and I'll explain that a little bit more also later. But for the $260,000 of your side fund liability, we think it's a prudent thing to do. Once you pay off your side fund liability, it's gone. It won't come back again. However, if they reduce the number of risk pools from about 9 down to what they're proposing to 2, 1 for safety, 1 for miscellaneous, every agency in the state, safety, will join the safety pool, and every agency in the state, miscellaneous, will join the miscellaneous pool. Because your funding ratio is different from all of the other agencies that join a new pool, it will create a new side fund liability. But that side fund liability has nothing to do with the one that already exists. And a new side fund liability would simply be the unfunded liabilities that you already have. Now I'd like to explain, and this is what I'm really leading up to, the U.S. Government Accounting Office recommends that you have no less than 80% funding in a retirement plan. You're currently at 73% for both safety and miscellaneous. This is your two liabilities for police and miscellaneous, totals $48 million. 80% of that $48 million is $39 million. You currently have $35.6 million in market value of assets with PERS. To get to that 80% funding, you need $3,350,000. We believe that one of the prudent uses also of your general fund reserves is to segregate that amount out of your undesignated, unreserved fund balance in the general fund and either put it in a separate internal service fund or designate it within the general fund as being set aside to maintain your funding in PERS at 80% right now. You can decide later if you would like to up that percentage, but in order to conform with what the U.S. Government Accounting Office is suggesting, we recommend that you set that money aside. You would then be at 80% funding now. So let me talk just very briefly about PERS, and I'll go back and show you this slide. You'll notice that your unfunded liability for miscellaneous went from $5 million to 6.4 in that 2-year period, and that your safety went from 5.2 to 6.7. What caused that was their investment return did not meet their actuarial assumption. They only made 1%. Your liability continues to climb always. But if your assets go down because they don't make their actuarial assumption, the gap between your assets and your liability grows, and that's your unfunded liability. So that's probably solely what caused those unfunded liabilities to increase, is they didn't make their actuarial assumption. The latest information we have from PERS is as of June 30, 2012. You will get information as of June 30, 2013, around October, November of this year. We already know that their investment return for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2013, was a little over 13%. They more than met their actuarial assumption. I guarantee you that when you get the actuarial report at the end of this year, you're going to see your unfunded liability go down and your funding ratio go up. So setting this money aside is something you're doing to be prudent now, but you can adjust this every year. That's one thing. The second thing is that we also know that your employer contribution rates are going to be going up starting in 15-16. They've already told us that. They've been telling us that for 2 years. Initially, what they told us is that your rates will go up 10% each year for 5 years, which is a 50% increase at the end of by the end of the 5th year. Will stay there for 20 years before they start to go down. They've backed off of that now, and the reason they backed off of it is because every agency in PERS is different. Every agency in PERS is at a different funding level. So now they're giving ranges of those increases. But within those ranges, we know that your contribution rates are going to go up. Setting this money aside also helps cover money that you may need to cover those increases in the future. So we don't know yet what those are going to be. We will know, for the first year anyway, we'll know what that increase is going to be around October, November of this year. You also have a rather large unfunded liability called OPEB, or Other Post-Employment Benefits, which is health insurance. It's also based on an actuarial report under Governmental Accounting Standards Board requirements. You are required to get an actuarial evaluation once every 3 years. So this is based upon an evaluation that was done in 2013. The actuary has set your unfunded liability at $2.7 million. The amount that you have reserved or set aside as part of your general fund reserves is $250,000. I looked at the report from the actuary, and the actuary is recommending that you have $382,000 at June 30, 2014. But the actuary wants you to get to 100% funding. And I'm not sure it's necessary for you to get to 100% funding. You might even do the same 80% that PERS is trying to get you to. The difference, though, between this and PERS, two things. Number one, PERS's assumption is a 7.5% return on investment. Since you're not sending this money to anybody, since you are basically investing this money yourself as part of the city's investment portfolio, and since you haven't diversified your portfolio, you're earning about 0.25% on this money, when the actuary is assuming that you will earn 5% on this money. So your unfunded liability isn't going to grow because you're not earning the actuarial assumption. But the other thing is that he's funding this over a 15-year period instead of a 30-year period. So you actually, I believe, could also take a look at trying to set this money aside over a 30-year period and not a 15-year period. And then finally, this is my last slide, future challenges. One of the reasons we're going to have you take a look at fund balance policy is we believe that one of the prudent things to do in financial management for a city is to look into the future and contemplate increases that you know are coming and set aside money to pay for those increases so that when they do come, they're not a shock to your budget, that you do have those funds available. And if you look at the items that are making up the $520,000 for fiscal year 14-15, good majority of that, more than 50% of that money, could have been set aside in prior years if you had a internal service fund for facility capital repair and replacement. If you had an internal service fund for risk management activities to set aside money for unexpected increases in workers' comp, public liability, either claims or insurance. If you had a set aside for things like PERS, I've included down at the bottom an ADA study for city facilities. Not only do you know that you're going to have to do an ADA study for city facilities, you're also going to have to be spending money after that to bring your facilities up to compliance with ADA. And that's going to cost you money. All of that will be discussed at the meeting in 2 weeks, but we want to get council to start thinking about some of the money that's currently in undesignated fund balance for the general fund. Think about start to set aside some of that money in internal service funds or set it aside in reserves to contemplate these expenses that are coming in the future. The CAD RMS replacement that I have on this slide here, we don't know yet what the exact amount's going to be. We're estimating about $700,000 to $800,000, but it's a guess. Yeah, we really don't know what that amount's going to be. The second item, the CalPERS employer rate increases, we don't know yet what those amounts are going to be. We won't know until we get to about October, November of this calendar year. The 800 megahertz system, we pretty much know it's going to be about $110,000 a year for 4 years. And the last item, we know that the ADA study is $75,000. It is included in the capital improvement program for 14-15, but it's shown as an unfunded item. So even though it's in the CIP, we've not yet designated a funding source for that. That's where the use of an internal service fund for facilities capital repair and replacement would have come in very handy. What we would recommend is setting aside money now, but also as seed money, but also setting aside money each year over a long period of time to pay for these things when they know they're going to need to be replaced. Like the CAD RMS system, you've already had to do that once, maybe even twice. You know it's coming again, you know it'll be coming again in 10 to 15 years or whatever the cycle is. If you can start setting aside the money now on an annual basis, then it won't be such a shock to your budget when you actually have to pay to replace the system. And with that, that concludes my presentation, and now we'd like to open it up to comments, questions, whatever you'd like to talk about.
Great, thank you. Anyone from the council?
Is it appropriate to get feedback from the budget subcommittee at this point? Before we start going into things?
Sure. Rich, I don't know if you want to start or...
Feedback, and you want to ask questions of us? Or you just want us to give our opinion of where we are?
Well,
Why don't you start with that? And then we can
why don't you start with that, because we kind of have an idea of where we are. But go ahead.
Well, it's not a pretty picture. You know, we're spending more than we're taking in. While Glenn was speaking, I was looking, in 5 years, we've increased our spending 20%. We've increased our revenue 3.8%. It's not a trend that can continue. I like the fact that both Brett and Glenn are suggesting that we look at a more comprehensive budgeting that starts to predict the future a little bit more and says, not only do we have our basic day-to-day expenses, we know we have these other expenses, so we can't spend money like we're spending everything we take in with no planning for the future. And that is, it's not really smart. Probably part of the problem we're in today, comes from that. We have some large capital items. Now, we have some suggestions that will come up next time about the use for the one-time items. But we have to, as a council, kind of look at the one-time items versus the ongoing items, and then come to a balance between the uses of our funds and our general fund.
Yeah, I guess I would add, I think you guys should look at the budget from two perspectives, short-term and long-term. And I think the short-term problem is we have a $520,000 issue, and as Rich just said, we'll talk about that. The bigger issue is the long-term. And in your staff report on page 2 of 8, I would just draw your attention to items 1 through 13, where, Rich highlights the point that we have a revenue problem and we are having challenges with costs. And, we, from a due diligence part, everything has been opened up in the, through this ad hoc committee. And proof of that is these 13 items that some of them are sacred things that we should never address based on what the community thinks, like looking at the youth center, looking at what's going on with police, whether we can continue to afford it. Kind of the principle in the long term, and Chief and I have talked about this too, is we need to sustain a police department. When you talk to anybody in our community, and you ask them, why did I go to LaSalle? The police, response in 3 minutes, and the school district. And, but at some point, we need to involve the community into this process that says, look, we can't sustain this model. And if you guys want us to make the decision for you on the council, and because the only direction we can go is start telling the chief, cut back on the number of people out there, because their salaries don't go away. They're benchmarked against other communities. People always say, well, use the sheriff, right? The reality is the sheriff has the same cost per police officer, so that just means less police officers. So the issue to the community is get involved at some point and engage with the council through this process longer term, and what will we do to help support things that we care about. And that's why you see dramatic things in here like a parcel tax or an increase in utility users tax. We're not suggesting that, but nothing should be off the table. If we care about, and as a community, to have a legitimate police department, and we care about the levels of service, then we should engage and look at everything, because we honestly cannot keep affording these changes. Some of the unique things, electronic billboards, we have a tremendous amount of area in the riverbed that we can't use. We've tried to put gardens in there. We've tried to put sports fields in there. There's no access. So can you use that for passive electronic billboards like you see in Huntington Beach or in Lawndale, or fill in the blank, to generate passive revenue? Be creative. How can we use the traffic to our advantage when every other aspect of it is not to our advantage? So those are long-term issues. Let me go back to the short term. In the short term, what we're hoping that the rest of the council will do, and the community, and this is a challenge to the community too, $520,000, our shortfall can be broken up into 3 categories. CIP issues like the pool, are we going to take care of it? Funding for the 800 megahertz, this police cost that we could have planned for better as a council, but it's here and we need to do it, and we're part of a team called Westcom with all the police area around here and every other jurisdiction, so we need to pay our share, so it's coming. We may come to a conclusion, and I think you'll see Rich and I will probably advocate that is a legitimate, huge chunk of that $520,000 that potentially we could use some amount of our $7 million of reserves on. You could also take a look at some of the operational costs, like some of these added pension and some of the stuff we pay as we go. If we start getting on let's just keep filling it with reserves, that's probably not a good use of our reserves. It makes us feel good in the short term, we got money to do it, but we can't sustain it. That was Rich's point. The last category, the 520, is what I would call risk assessment. And, you know, if you start going through there, and Glenn will put that chart up on that we talk about, you know, what are some of the drivers of this $520,000, you'll notice that in the last bullet in there, item number, or the third one down there, the increased, you know, $115,000, there's a lot of things that we can passively plan for, and you could justify we're using reserves because minimum wage potentially is going to go up, but it hasn't yet. So if you plan for it and you use it, then that's a prudent use of the reserves. Our only point on the ad hoc committee for the short term is the 520's there. I think 200 to 300,000, that 520 will be able to make an easy policy decision that we could probably justify using reserves like 800 megahertz. The rest, we either need to get tough with staff and say can't do it, or we need to get tough with ourselves and figure out new revenue sources in the short term. Any one of these 13 items that we use in the long term isn't going to generate a dollar more tomorrow when tomorrow's when we need it. It'll like a year from now, 2 years from now. So, you know, our call to you guys as the council for the May 19th, and why we didn't want to get into to too much detail in this discussion, is we really wanted to set the big picture view, understand all the pieces we can move around, and then ask the community, what are you thinking? And also, while you're thinking about it, think about the long term, because we don't necessarily want to do these 13 things or even a subset of them. But then we need to decide, is the police budget or parks and recreation or community service or maintaining our parks, what's the most important to the community? So we should have 15 people here from the community during public hearing telling us what their opinion is or more. So again, we opted to not give a specific recommendation and really to let this gestate at the highest level so you guys can come back. And I think that was our view. Thank you.
Jane, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
I appreciate that. One of the problems in looking at the 13 items is that there's no real identity of projected cost to any of that. So, you know, everything from a parcel tax for public safety to increase on the utility users tax, the future of cable functions in Los Al, I'm not sure that there's any money. If we just eliminated LATV right now, what's that going to do? Is that really going to make any kind of a dip or a chunk into any of this?
Dean, do you have an answer?
Well, I'll try. I mean, in terms of, we do intend to come back and put some either cost estimate reduction or revenue estimated increase on this list to give you a more comprehensive list the next time. In terms of the cable television function and elimination of Los Alamitos television, I put this on here because it's something that in analyzing the revenues that come in from the PEG monies and analyzing the future costs of cable and the fund balance that we have in that special revenue fund right now, which is dwindling, the costs far exceed the revenues coming in. So it means that the 100+ thousand that's in the fund balance of the cable fund is going to dwindle down to zero, and there's going to be a general fund impact. And I've been feeding that information to the Cable Commission. We have another meeting this Thursday, but I want to make them aware that my opinion is we only have about $30,000 in the $1 per household fee that comes into the city, $30,000, and we have one equipment list that's $40,000, $50,000, maybe more, and we have about $120,000 in fund balance. So something has to give, and that's why I put that on there. It is going to be a general fund impact. I mean, there's a general fund impact now for the filming of the meetings and some of the other activities, a smaller impact than what there can be in the future if we continue on with it. So as
rather than putting you on a spot on each one of those, because that raises an ire for a certain segment of the community, I just think we need to have better ideas of what you're thinking about in the process. And using that one item of the LATV, there is an annual income on it, and it's roughly $31,000 a year. They were prudent in the past of setting aside money and have, give or take, $100,000 in reserves. But if they want to save it, if they want to do things, and they, as a commission, are going to need to get creative about how they generate revenue. And there's discrepancy at this particular point of whether they have that opportunity. So I don't see this as necessarily being a fix for the 520 or even long-term, but I do see there is a long-term issue there that they need to address on a higher level than getting down into the, well, they want to spend this on equipment and whatever. There's a trade-off all the way along. The idea of selling banner space or electronic billboards and things like that are things we should definitely be looking at. In terms of questions on your proposal or your slides and your information here, if I can do that at this particular point, we can point, I guess we can point fingers at a lot of things that this council, prior councils have done or not done that put us into this situation. The obvious issue right now, the elephant in the room, if you will, with the 800 megahertz radios, that's been known for 5 years. And that bullet's not been attacked until now. And we're going to have to do something. And I made the comment when we first started talking about it that if this radio system lasted for 20 years, the council 20 years from now needs to have some funds to do this all over again. With the exception that the way a lot of this happens, it's not going to be 20 years. It's going to last. It'll be maybe 10, 15. But it's important on staff to get that information, to get it to us, to put it in so that we're doing the kinds of things in anticipating in the future of what we're going to do. And then policy-wise, we can start to make some decisions because the cost of sustaining police services is one, has just been increasing exponentially in the process. And we really need the community's impact and input, rather, from what do they expect and what are they willing to do. I've said that I think the community would be willing to impose a tax on themselves to maintain the service levels. But do they? Are they willing to do that? And that's more a long-term fix. It's not going to take care of the 520,000, but I think there's other things in looking through the budget that on more of a micro level instead of the macro level, I've seen things in there at this particular point that I question why they're there. And I wonder if there isn't a way to somehow, as a council, get engaged with each of the departments on some of those questions and have them prepared to justify and defend why these things are in there. The question regarding the gasoline sales tax, and you indicated that some of this solely on gas tax revenues. Are you aware that the Board of Equalization has reduced that tax starting July the 1st by 3%, if I'm not mistaken?
I am, but there won't be a reduction to cities for that reduction that the state is making.
So who gets that credit then?
We still get the same amount of, now gas tax and sales tax on gasoline, first of all, it's two different things. I want to make that clear. What I'm talking about here is gas tax, not sales tax. We are still going to get our regular share of gas tax revenue. The decrease at the state level is going to be, that hit is going to be taken by the state, not by the cities.
Okay.
The sales tax on gasoline shows up in our sales tax revenue.
Right. Well, we're going to need, I think, as a council, better engagement with Sacramento on a lot of this stuff, a lot more proactively than we've ever been, even though we're small players. I'm trying to figure out my question here. Who all is in this risk pool not swimming pool, but the insurance risk pool. You said there's a
Well, you mean
lot
for
of-
retirement?
No,
Only the retirement are we in a risk pool. For the OPEB, the other post-employment benefits, which is health insurance, we're not in a risk pool. That liability is only for the city of Los Alamitos, and we're not in a pool.
okay,
We're only in a pool for retirement.
okay, so the regular insurance is the JPIA group, the CJIPA?
Yeah, we're in a risk management pool in that respect for workers' compensation and general liability claims.
Okay, and that's gone up.
The premiums have gone up on for workers' comp and for general liability in fiscal year 2014-15. Both of the premiums have gone up.
Okay, and is there explanations behind that from them? Is the pool taking a bigger hit? They're looking at the smaller guys to be paying that, or what?
Cal JPIA smooths out those claims over a 10-year period, and so, but individual cities, if they have claims on both the workers' comp and liability that have gone up more than historic, eventually the premiums will hit. It's smoothed over a period of time. So there's a pooled portion of the increase, and there's also an individual piece, but they've smoothed it out over a 10-year period.
Okay, I'd like better information on that since I'm on that board, to kind of help in that regard. I was on council 2008 when we approved going to that organization insurance-wise, and we were fed bad information by that city manager at the time on the reasoning for moving that direction. And I think we should be looking at if there's other options that are more cost-effective to us. Usually in a pool type of a situation, we come out better. But if we're looking at increases, and unless we've had loss increases that are attributable to that, I know there's been some workers' comp stuff, but, as far as general liability and things of that nature, property liability, that's another option I think staff could be looking at.
We can bring back some additional information on the 19th for that. But also on the workers' comp side, that it's not just the premiums for the current claims, but we were part of a pool in the past for tail claims or past claims. A big swing on the workers' comp side is attributable to past claims back from 2002, 2003. We're still
And I'm aware
hit.
of that because I asked that question at the time when CJPIA was here making a presentation. Was this new insurance claims made or occurrence-based? Because the claims made does come with a tail and you have to buy your way out of it. And their response was it essentially was neither, because they're not the insurance company. They're a broker that brokers that insurance and brokers it on behalf of the people that are participating, and they've increased since that time the amount of people that are participating. But it's still not clear from the standpoint of whether we're still in a claims-made approach or whether we're on an occurrence base, and it's a significant difference, dollar and cents-wise, to the policyholder, which is us. And so I would like better dialogue, especially before their meeting in June, July that's coming up, so that I can address that a little bit better. On the PERS stuff, the 80% you talked about, that's the U.S. funding, or U.S. government accounting office wants us to be at 80%.
That's the minimum amount they suggest that you set your funding level at for retirement. The minimum funding level should be...
And we're at 73 right now.
And we're at 73.
Okay, and so coming back with some dialogue, I don't want it now, we're 7% off from where they would like us to be. Is that something that has to be done incrementally all at once, or can we increase it 1% or 2% going forward unless we find some revenue stream that we can apply to that? In other words, do we have to make a 7% increase now?
We do not.
Okay.
That's a recommendation, but you don't even have to fund it at a greater rate than what you're at right now in
Currently,
PERS.
okay.
For purposes of comparison, just so you know, the pool, and I can only talk about the pool, because again, you didn't have numbers for Los Alamitos. At the end of '06, '07, you were 99% funded for police, and you were 96.5% funded for miscellaneous in the pool. I don't know what it was for your individual city. I have to believe that you might have been a little bit higher than that because you're very well funded now compared to other cities. The average funding for PERS-wide, all agencies in PERS, all pools, all agencies, is 66%, and you're 73%.
So we're ahead of the game in that regard.
But what caused it to come from 99 or 96.5 down to 73, obviously, is the huge investment losses in PERS from '07, '08 to '08, '09.
And the other part of that is we have no control over that.
Absolutely. No one has control over it. Only PERS has control over that.
I get that, and because kind of like the county going bankrupt back in '94, you know, we had investment in some of that pool. It's like you mentioned that we're getting 0.5% return right now on investments, and yet they're guaranteeing 7%, and they actually came in at 13%. It's pooling money together and taking that risk in the process of what you're going to do. The real problem is when they make risky investments, or they make investments in stuff that blow up on Wall Street and everything tanks, we're held accountable for things that we had nothing to do with. And I don't know whether that's an issue where we've talked about the treasurer and the investment that the city makes in secure returns, secure investments versus some more gambling, I guess, in the process. Yeah, that's something we really need to be looking at too, I think, because needless to say, we're responsible for the taxpayers' money. We don't want to be taking that kind of a risk, but at the other side, when we're looking at the potential of going back, talking about increases in property tax or increases in utility user fees and things of that nature, I hope the community understands there's some serious issues on the quality of life that we need their engagement in the process, and that they need to be better educated in terms of this process as well, because I can see people coming in saying, well, I want this, but no, I'm not willing to make a sacrifice on that, or I'm not willing to have less officers in the field, or we go back to walkie-talkies or something to that effect, which, I mean, it's a little ridiculous. We can't do that. I think I've made notes, but I'll try and reduce this down and send you an internal memo on the process. I do have a lot of questions related to the budget material that we've been presented, and I had a discussion from the standpoint of my colleagues with the city manager that in years prior, we had each department here that kind of gave us a presentation on their department in terms of accomplishments, things they saw coming in the future, and what they projected in the process. Councilman Egger made the comment about the pool. The pool, from the standpoint of the community, we can't replace that pool. We wouldn't have the funds to be able to do it. There was a program put into place regarding user fees on the pool. That was also part of that rationale that the school district used in terms of user fees to help sustain and maintain a higher level of maintenance at the parks. Well, my question, and I can't find it in here, my question relative to the pool is, where's that money? If everybody using the pool, there was a program set up to do it, and I'm not asking for a question, I'm saying these are the kinds of dialogues we should probably have be able to have with the different departments. They set a fee, a per-user fee, every time a kid went into the pool, it cost money. And that was retained for ongoing maintenance. And if that was the case, where is that money? And why isn't that money being tapped to do some of the things that are needed for the pool? The foundation that was originally established when the pool was created has spent, to the best of my knowledge, has spent most of the money that they have. They're still in existence, but the same thing kind of applies. Is there something else we need to be doing to help increase that? The relationship with the base and the issues that we have with the base relative to tax, trash pickup, and whether we're paying it, they're paying it, the utilities, all of these different things, we really need to have a more direct impact over there, I think, from the standpoint of the leadership of the base. And at our meeting on the 19th, I'm going to bring something to you that is going to drastically change the base, in my opinion, in the immediate future, probably within the next 60 days. And that has nothing to do with BRAC or anything else. It's just what's happening within the rank and file of people on the base. And to me, it's more critical that we are engaged with base leadership on the things that are moving forward and things that are happening, because we do have investments over there relative to the pool and other functions that are going on. We have the same issue that we're getting from residents relative to operational things at the base, and there's only so much they're able to do in the process as well. So there's some relationship gaps that I think we need to really look at and address moving forward. Again, I would like the opportunity to go through with this from the standpoint, just some highlights from the standpoint of things I'm seeing. The amount of dues to associations. You know, we're at a point where I think we need to start looking at them. We're at a point with the Association of California Cities of looking at the expense council-wise of dues that we're spending to that versus the return that we're getting. Some cities have backed out of it, other cities have added, and yet functions that we would go to that I cherish more as networking opportunities, going there at a dinner is $160. And that's in addition to other dues that we're already paying. And I'm just questioning, not only with them, but the League of California Cities, any organization that this city belongs to, a list of who all of the different associations are that the city belongs to, department-wise or what other. I think we need to start to look at them and saying, how valuable is that association? How critical operationally from the standpoint of Parks and Recreation or police or anybody, we need to have some input. We need to have some dialogue in that regard so that everybody is looking from the standpoint of, are these things that we can do without? Are these hardcore things that we absolutely have to belong to, or can we get the benefits some other way in the process? And I think those are good self-evaluation questions that the departments can take a look at and bring back. I'll be happy to provide a list of those to my fellow colleagues and staff of some of the things, and maybe that can bring our discussions on the 19th into a little bit more fruitful from that aspect of what we're doing. There's some programs and some of these things that I question from the standpoint. There's a list on the summary list here of the 13 things was to eliminate donated services at special events. You know what? I don't have a problem with that if that's what we're going to do across the board. There's police overtime for wings, wheels, and rotors. Why is it overtime? And how much are we required as the city to provide for an event like that relative to any other thing that occurs in the city? My opinion is, for my 2 cents on it, my opinion is we take care of the community. The base, the military police, and they brought on another military unit over there, should be responsible for what's happening on the base. Traffic going in and out, that's going to be ours. But How does that play when we have a playoff game at the high school or any of the other events and functions that come on? Those are certain things that are going to occur that the police have to approach and approve on. But I wasn't aware we were doing overtime. And that's where that big amount of money comes in. Those are discussions, policy discussions, that I think we need to have to make some decisions in the process of what we're going to do. So I'll stop at this point so everybody else can have an opportunity. Thank you.
Councilmember Kuzmoto, anything?
Yeah, I just want to thank Councilmember Gross for asking some thorough questions. And I did have some questions of the Finance Director prior, and I think I got those answered. So it's unfortunate some of the revenues are going down on the gas tax, for one. I thought that was the natural gas tax, the utility user tax. That was kind of surprising to me, but it's unfortunate that it has decreased. But other than that, I asked some questions, I got the answers. I think they're pretty straightforward, so thank you for that.
Thank you. I too called prior to the meeting and asked some questions, and you've answered some of those questions again here tonight regarding the fluctuation in amounts that we receive and the variables that affect those revenues or expenditures. You answered my question as to whether or not we need to pay the amount up to the 80%. If you could, very quickly, what is the benefit for us bringing that to 80% for the PERS funding? If we were to bring it to 80%?
Yeah, the benefit really is it makes it appear that the city is looking forward and managing its finances more prudently. So it gives the appearance that the city really pays attention to where our funding level is at and that we want to stay at the 80% level. If you don't do it, you might get there simply because PERS investment return gets you there.
Changes, okay.
But the opposite could happen. We could go into another recession or a downturn in the economy, and your funding might go the other way. So you are very dependent upon investment return in PERS.
Okay, great. I think Richard wants to add something to that.
Just to clarify, you're speaking of adding to the reserves, not spending the money, correct?
That is
Just-
absolutely
I think that's got
correct.
lost, okay.
That's absolutely correct. I am not recommending that you spend this money. I'm simply recommending you designate it for PERS retirement to keep your funding level at 80% or any other level that you choose. If PERS return on investment increases significantly, let's say over the next couple of years, we already know that June 30th, 13 was over 13%. For the first 6 months of this fiscal year, 13-14, it was over 16%. But for the last 6 months of this fiscal year, we don't know yet what it's going to be.
Right.
I don't think it's been as good as it has for the first 6 months. So I can't even answer the question as to whether they're going to make their actuarial assumption by the end of this fiscal year. But let's say we have 2 or 3 years in a row. You might get above 80% just because of those investment returns. We're simply saying don't count on it. By setting aside the 80% and trying to keep it at that level, you're not depending upon PERS to make sure that you maintain your funding at 80%.
Right, we're not affected by the fluctuations in those.
Correct.
Okay. We've talked about LAIF investments prior to this. There were things brought forward by a couple of different finance directors that we chose not to go with, and so I hope that we seriously look at that because for some time it's been stagnant and below 1%, and I don't know that that's the best use of people's money. The pool's a good thing to look at. I know you brought it up. We've talked about that in the past, where it's not costing us money, but yet we see all of these costs for improvement. So when we get to that point, we'll talk about it more in depth. And I, like I said, I asked my questions prior to, and I had those answers. So I have nothing else. Does anyone else like a second round?
I just would like to kind of close with a couple points. You know, the team that is put together with staff and our new city manager, I think Richard and I would both say Very interesting approach that he's, the headline of this says that I think he's pretty much really focused on pushing a different type of fiscal policy. It's kind of the no hostages type policy for reserves. He's looking at the money in the reserves and saying, you know what, you just can't keep it there. You have real liabilities. And then for the things that shocked us, like the 800 megahertz, you can't sit back and not plan for these things. So you either put that money from the reserves where it needs to be, or use it where it needs to be paid. I think that, and again, this is just my opinion, but I think that you really are seeing an aggressive perspective from staff. We had 4 or 5 ad hoc meetings to try and get our hands on this with staff, and it was pretty aggressive. I mean, from where we started to where we're at, there's a couple things that it would be helpful for me to know is our role on the ad hoc committee is, we want to make sure that we're meeting your expectations of what we should be doing. And so one part of it is to stand up and say we justify that we went through this in a lot of details to save you guys the concerns on revenues and expenses, and that the numbers are tied out to the extent when you got the CPA over here asking really tough questions the whole time. So, I mean, that's all good. Part of that is we would push back to you guys a little bit and say, hey, do we want to use the council meetings to focus on the $800,000 problems, the $400,000 problems, or some of the details? Are we doing enough on the ad hoc committee to knock some of the smaller stuff out of the way so that when you come back, you guys have meetings with the staff and you guys iron out? If you want a department head, call in Corey and say, hey, look, Corey, tell me what you've done. What we're trying to do is get that hour or two that we would have the budget meeting into being a constructive, things you couldn't win in the staff discussion. You still have a disagreement, but it's nice with staff, and let's talk about it because it's a policy issue. That's what we've been trying to do our part. So if there's anything else we could do there. On the CIP budget, really the same 800 megahertz problem that we have the same problem with pools, with our swimming pool. We have the same problem with our streets. So think about this. For streets, we only spend $400,000 a year, and it's only the money we get in M2 and M1 money from the county. We don't put any of our own money aside. So if we don't like the level, the quality of our streets, how fast we get to other neighborhoods, then we ought to start putting aside, just like the 800 megahertz, this is a good symbol to be able to plan. Think about that. We're already $520,000 short, and we haven't started contingency budgeting yet. So we've got a real problem. When you look at the general fund policy, of looking at these liabilities, this reserve thing, I think what is happening here from our perspective is, Glenn and Brett are looking at the 3 parts of the unfunded liability. And the headline of that story is we've only been planning for one, OPED. So now we got to take on, the miscellaneous portions of that with law enforcement and the miscellaneous, and those are big numbers. But the reality is all I think Glenn is saying, and believe me, that the problem is Glenn has like 15 more layers of data that if you want to take that on, please set up a time, because Rich and I had to ask him to clip it back because he's, hey, here's the rates of returns for 30 years. It got into a pretty technical discussion. But the summary of what he's showing you at the end, it's pretty accurate. It's very accurate. And so, Glenn, I would say thank you, and Brett. And again, guys, I guess the parting shot is if there's anything else we can do as an ad hoc committee, we do have a couple more meetings set, so we're trying to really prepare based on the feedback we got today, any from the public, which was none, unfortunately, this time, to really get this set up and give feedback to staff. The biggest thing I think, Dean, that I got from you two is in the potential idea bucket, there may be ideas that you guys have for revenue, and you may or may not like the ones that were brought up, but at a minimum, we need to have associated estimated values for them. Got it. We need to do that. So I think, Rich, anything else in closing comments on the ad hoc?
Closing comment is just what a pleasure it is to work with Glenn. As Troy said, he goes way deeper than either of us can follow, well, speaking for myself, but we do have to ask him to cut it back. But what's amazing is for the first time, Glenn's been able to tell us not only what's happening, why it's happening, and it's been a revelation. And when we saw the unfunded numbers for the first time, I think we both turned gray for 2 days. But then slowly we started to understand what was going on, and that the problem was about kind of where we always thought it was, but it was a net number. We never had the gross numbers. That was the difference. Glenn was able, to boil this down to understandable, which really was quite an accomplishment. So thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I just
Mayor
wanna-
Pro Tem Murphy.
Yeah, I just want to circle back, one more, I guess, question back to the ad hoc then. Troy, I appreciate what you brought up. So I think if I understand where you're kind of on some of the, I guess, flavors of what you're talking about, I think past philosophy is hold reserves as sacred, don't touch. And I have always had this question saying, how much is too much? So I think I'm hearing then, I think what Glenn was saying, a policy that makes sense. How much reserves do we really need? The investment we should make today, the earmarks we need to set aside for the other, I think that's all great dialogue, and I'm really on board with that. I think we just need to look forward, and again, it's invest we have, we're in very good shape, but we can't just hold on to it tightly where it's not doing any work, or it's having a negative impact in the longer run. So I'm really for that. So thank you for doing the work that you've been doing.
Thank you, Councilmember Kuzma. Councilmember Gross?
I would echo the same thing from the standpoint of a good job done by the whole team, including the ad hoc committee. I'm hopeful that this committee continues on, even though ad hocs are temporary for one-time issues, but I think we need to have that dialogue ongoing. You both are the numbers guys, if you will, from the standpoint that have the questions, know where you're looking, and I have no problems with what you've done. What would help is if we could get some type of interim report or feedback coming in so that it's not all down. In other words, if you've met 4 times at this particular point, I think this is about the first time we've really had that opportunity, and I don't know, City Attorney, whether they can prepare a majority staff report or committee report back to share with the rest of us. Here's the things we're looking at, because some of this may be things, as I said, I found the budget proposal fascinating, but I came up with a bunch of questions. If we really got the 520,000, and I'm not questioning that we do, I think from a policy standpoint, we need to start looking at where money is being spent and the return of that money, the return of value of that money in the process, because I can see where a big chunk of that 520,000 can come from without doing anything except administratively here saying, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore, or we're not going to do that anymore, or you need to be able to provide the justification for why it's important that we do that. And some of that feedback to you guys maybe can help minimize that, or at least come back and say, you know what, we've looked at it, it's not good. It doesn't mean we don't think we're going to get anywhere with that. Something to that effect, so that we've got the dialogue back and forth. If we have to do it, at a meeting, then I think we allocate a certain amount of time at the meeting for that kind of a feedback to help us in the process. But what we've done thus far, I think, is good, and I agree with the reserve issues. We set aside 25% when I was on council before as an emergency amount, and we've never done anything with that. It was either 20 or 25%, and everything increases. So what is that money sitting there supposed to be if the earthquake hits and everything crumbles? Is that what that money is for? I think a better definition from that standpoint. If we're going to take money and earmark it for PERS, then that takes more money that's there but not available. It's like putting a reserve on your checking account that you don't go below that amount. And I think that creates some misconception both on the part of council and on the part of the public that sits there and says, look, we need help fixing this. We need money to do that. Look, there's money there. I can automatically see at this point we've got 320,000. We're anticipating somewhere in that neighborhood. Excess this time, well, gee, that's 2/3 of the 520,000, so we're really not in any bind. It's just patchwork, Band-Aid fixing, and that's not the long-term thing that we need to be looking at. And Warren made the same comment. Let's figure out what it is exactly is there and why it's there, and then we have a better idea of if something comes up that's needed to be done, then we know that money is available for that purpose. So,
Okay, and I'll go really quickly. Lastly, I think that Councilmember Gross made a comment earlier about past councils not planning ahead, and I think you're correct partially in that, but we did start with the $250,000 that we set aside. We began doing this, and with the 800 megahertz, we did discuss it, but I don't think we had that much of a surplus, so we didn't have the opportunity to do that. Yes, long-term planning, I think it's a great idea, and we have talked as a council, but there just hasn't been the funds to do that, as we could see, without making drastic cuts to either police or, to our community services that we provide. We weren't willing to do that, especially with the healthy reserve. From what I understood, and I don't know if this is current, but, they recommend you have 10 to 15% reserve based on your total budget. That's a comfortable reserve. We have almost a full year. I mean, if you look at it at the projections that we have here. I think, Dean, what you were saying about the emergency fund set aside for disasters, I think maybe what we could do, and maybe this is what you were saying, is have a certain amount as opposed to a percentage, so that additional percentage that's grown over time could go towards something more necessary. I did talk to the city manager and our finance director regarding the $520,000 that we would have as a deficit. We do have the surplus of $332,000, which can be applied, which leaves us only about $188,000. And I know you see that as piecework, but what I look at it as is taking care of the immediate issues without having to dive into the reserves for more than about $200,000 at the very most. That way we protect our reserves, we have the necessities that we need, we meet the requirements that we have to, and then we begin this long-term planning. I don't know if the others agree with me on that, but that seems to be the most logical pursuit, and I guess that's something we can talk about further down the road, but those are the only comments that I have. So with that, do we have anything else from the city manager?
No, thank you for all the comments. We appreciate your time and appreciate all the staff's effort and Glenn's effort and budget subcommittee. Thank you very much.
And we want to say thanks to all the students who came and sat through that extremely tiresome presentation. Hope you can get something good out of that. We're going to go ahead and recess back into closed session. City Attorney, do you want to discuss the items?
Yes, the closed session is to further discuss labor negotiations with the two unions and also conference with legal counsel, that's me, regarding pending litigation pursuant to subdivision D4 of Government Code Section 54956.9, two potential cases.
Great, thank you. We'll go ahead and recess.